Hi everyone! My name is Jenny Lucia Marciano, your teacher in TLE subject. This time we are going to discuss the electrical measuring tools and instruments. So let's start! The first measuring tool that we are going to discuss is test light. Test light is a pocket-sized tool used to test the line wire or circuit if there is a current in it. Kung may kuryente ba na dumadali doon po natin ginagamit yung test light. So for you to understand or to see how to use the test light, please watch this video.
Sa pagtetest, sundot na sa butas ng outlet. Hindi pwedeng sabay. Okay, test natin guys. Para ito yung neon light natin. Saside ko na lang para makita natin yung iilaw yung neon light. Ayan. Para mapailaw natin yung neon light, kailangan nating itap yung pinaka-metal conductor dito sa taas ng ating daliri. Okay? Tap na natin. Ayan guys, nakikita nyo ito. Ayan siya. Ibig sabihin yan, live yung ating kuryente. So, sa kabila naman, try din natin. Ayan guys. Ganun lang kadali kung paano gamitin itong ating screwdriver. Yung tester natin. So, guys, kung bibili kayo nito, mas maganda yung may pangalan na. Tsaka huwag na yung pipitsugin kasi buhay natin nakasalalay dito, ha? So, ayun lang guys. Maraming salamat sa inyo. Hanggang sa muli, ha? Ako inyong Kuya Tano. Huwag kalilimutang mag-like at mag-subscribe. Thank you!
Okay, the next one is micrometer. It's used for measure the diameter of wires or conductor in circular mills. It can measure the small and big sizes of wires and cables. So watch this video on how to use the micrometer. Okay, so the next tool is wire gauge. Wire gauge is used in determining the size of wires or conductors. The gauge range from 0 to 60 AWG or American wire gauge. Watch this video on how to use the wire gauge tool.
Just because the corners can actually be quite sharp. So what you have here is you have this disc. And along the outside here, it shows you the wire gauge, and it goes from 0 all the way up, and it goes around, and then it keeps going around to 36. So it's going to show you gauges from 0 to 36. And what you're wanting to do is you're wanting them to fit within the slot. So don't worry about the little round spot down here. It's the slot right there that you want your wire to fit into. And if you flip it over, you'll see that it has its corresponding millimeters over here. So as you can see, 32 gauge wire is actually 0.27 millimeters. So that's handy to know too. So I want to show you really quickly how this works. I have an eye pin right here and a head pin as well. And if you're like me, you tend to store these where you don't put their labels on them, so you're always trying to figure out what they actually are. So with this eye pin right here, what you'll do is you can kind of guess where you think it might fall. So it goes right through the 19. Now that slides way too easily. So you go up to 20, still very easily. Go to 21, and that looks pretty much like a perfect fit. But I just want to double check and try the 22, and it's not going in. So that shows that this is a 21 gauge brass eye pin. I'm going to show you with one more. I've got this little head pin here in gunmetal, and I can tell it's a bit thinner, so I'm going to try the 21. It goes right through that really easily. 22, still going too easy. 23, pretty easy. 24, oops, I wiggled it and it went through, so that means it's going to fit. But I'm guessing it's 24 and it's not going to fit through a 25, but I'm just going to try it. Yep, it's not fitting. So this here is going to be a 24 gauge gunmetal head pin. And that's all there is to using a wire gauge guide. It's a very handy tool. And then when you're not using it, again, just make sure you put it back in its protective sleeve, and that's going to protect your fingers.
The next tool is ruler or foot rule. It is a measuring tool used to measure length, width, and thickness of a short, flat object and sketching straight lines. A ruler or a rule is a tool used, for example, in geometry, technical drawing, engineering, and carpentry, to measure lengths or distances or to draw straight lines. Strictly speaking, the ruler is the instrument used to rule straight lines, and calibrated instrument used for determining length called a measure. Hole push rule is a measuring tool used to measure the length of an object in centimeters and inches. The next tool is a meter. It is an instrument used to measure the amount of electrical current intensity in a circuit. The unit of measure is ampere. It is connected along or series to the circuit. For better understanding on how to use the ammeter, please watch this video.
You can connect either to the side, like that, or if you screw in those little plastic nuts, you can connect to the top. Just make sure you get metal every time you clamp. Two different ranges are represented by the positive 5 amp range or the positive 1 amp range, the two different connectors in the two different ranges. Remember, the ammeter measures the current. And since current is defined as the rate of charge flow, you have to put the ammeter inside the flow. Therefore, the ammeter is in what is called in series. You have to disconnect first, put that thing inside the circuit, like is shown there. Starting with this basic circuit, 2 wires, bulb, battery. Let's say that you want to measure there, the current flowing at that point. Disconnect at that point, place the ammeter in between the 2 points that you disconnected, and reconnect. Negative of the ammeter should be on the negative side of the battery, positive of the ammeter on the positive side of the battery. Start with the 5 amp range, and if it's below 1 that you see there, you can then move it to the 1 amp range and read the lower scale for a more precise measurement. Remember, ammeter measures current, the rate of flow of charge. Got to disconnect, you got to put that thing inside the circuit to measure current.
Okay, so the next tool is voltmeter. It is an instrument used to measure electrical pressure or voltage of a circuit. The unit of measure is volt. This is connected across or parallel to the circuit. For better understanding how to use the voltmeter, please watch this video.
Use a voltmeter. The instructions work for any meter, but this is the one that we use here in class. The big fat V says voltmeter. Notice there are two ranges, the upper range to 15, the lower range to 5, and the connector is down at the bottom. The black one is negative, and there are two positives, one for the 5 volt range at the bottom, one for the 15 volt range. That's the device. Some definitions are important. First, voltage is electric potential difference. Synonyms, and both of them are defined as the energy difference, or the energy change, or the energy loss, or the energy gain per coulomb between 2 points. And that is why we measure voltage this way. The voltmeter requires 2 leads. One is positive, one is negative. Negative always goes to the black. There are 2 possibilities for the positive. One has a maximum range of 15 volts. That's the one you start with. One that has a maximum range of 5 volts, which if it's below 5, you can move down to that. There's 2 different ways to connect it to these, either to the top or the side. Remembering that definition, that voltage is the energy difference per coulomb between those 2 points, you connect the voltmeter outside the circuit, in parallel between those 2 points. On the left is a battery, on the right is a resistor or a bulb. Let's say you want to measure the voltage across that resistor, the bulb on the right. Just take your 2 leads of the voltmeter, reach in and connect to the 2 sides of that portion of the circuit. The voltmeter stays outside the circuit, take the 2 leads, reach in, connect to the 2 points. Always link it to the definition. That's why the voltmeter is always outside. Reach in the 2 leads, touch the 2 points, measure the voltage between those 2 points.
Okay, so the next tool is clamp ammeter. Clamp ammeter is also called tongue tester. It is used to measure current flowing in a conductor. It is a clamp or hang in a conductor.
natin. Volts. Okay. Sa AC naman, kung AC naman, heating current, adjust lang natin siya. Adjust natin siya sa P. Then, makikita nyo yung DC kanina. AC. Tapos, yung dalawang test spread natin, yung dalawang test spread, tutusok natin siya dito. So, makikita ninyo, yung 194 volts. Okay? AC. Ganyan. Okay. Then, para i-ano natin, pag natin siya, pag gusto natin siya i-hold,
Okay, the last tool is voltmeter or VOM, otherwise called as multi-tester. Is used to measure the voltage, resistance, current of a circuit. It is connected in parallel or series with the circuit depending on what to measure. Okay, for you to understand the how to use the voltmeter, please watch this video.
Today we're going to be going back to the basics, and I'm going to be showing you how to properly use a multimeter. And we'll be covering how to measure DC voltage, AC voltage, resistance and continuity, and also how to measure amps. Alright, let's start with DC voltage. Basically, the main source of DC voltage in the different devices that we use these days are going to be batteries. Or in other words, anything that uses batteries runs on DC voltage. For example, anything on your car that runs off the car battery, your wireless D-volt drill, or any camera or camcorder that runs off a battery. They all run off of DC voltage. And if you're wondering, DC stands for direct current. And when you're using the multimeter to measure for DC voltage, you need to set your dial to this setting where you get a V for voltage and the straight and dotted line for direct voltage. And next, you need to make sure your test leads are in the right location. Now your ground or common test lead is always going to go right here where it says COM. But the red test lead is the one you're going to be switching around based on what you're measuring. And for measuring voltage, you need to place your red test lead here where you see the sign, which is V for voltage. Now as far as where you exactly want to set this dial when you're measuring voltage, you basically want to set this to the next number up from the maximum amount of voltage you're going to be measuring. So for example, if we're going to be measuring the voltage on this 1.5 volt AA battery, we're going to set our dial to 2 volts on the DC voltage scale. Next, we put our positive test lead on the power or positive side of our circuit, and then the ground test lead on the negative or ground side. And as you can see, we got 1.6 volts, which means this is a fully charged battery. And if you're ever unsure about the amount of voltage you're measuring, you can always start off higher, like we got here on 200, and then come lower to get a more precise reading. Now if you're ever unsure and hook up your test leads the wrong way, you're going to see this negative sign next to your voltage reading like we got here. Now this doesn't hurt the multimeter, and it's actually a pretty decent way of finding your positive and negative side of your circuit. Next up, measuring AC voltage. Basically any device that plugs into your wall socket uses AC voltage. And AC stands for alternating current. And when measuring for AC voltage, your black test lead stays in the same place obviously, and your red test lead stays in the same place, since again we're measuring voltage. Well, you need to switch your dial from DC voltage to the AC voltage area, and you know that by this wave sign that next to the V here. So next we're going to see whether we have current at a wall socket or not. And since we get about 110 volts here in the States, we're going to set our dial to 200, which is the next one up from the voltage we're expecting to measure. Alright, a word of caution, when measuring high voltage like this, you need to be 100% sure of the integrity of your multimeter, plus the wires that go to your test leads and the test leads themselves. Also, when you go to take your measurement, make sure your fingers are away from the tip of the test leads, but also when you get near the socket, that your test leads don't come into contact or near each other. So next we grab our ground test lead, and we're going to put this in the bigger slot on our wall socket. And then we grab our red test lead, and we're going to put it on this other side, which is the power side. And as you can see, we got 118 volts coming out of this, which is about right. Also, if you ever wondered what this one is for, this is your case ground. And a good way to check it is to see whether you get a reading when you do this, and we do, so this is good as well. Alright, next up, measuring resistance. And resistance is basically the amount of opposition that any substance has to the flow of electric current. So for example, this piece of wood is extremely resistant to the flow of current, whereas this wire has next to no resistance to the flow of electric current. Now, different components of an electric circuit are supposed to have a certain amount of resistance so that the whole system works properly, and that's where knowing how to exactly measure resistance is very crucial. Now, when measuring for resistance, your black test lead stays in the same place, and on this multimeter, the red test lead also stays in the same place because this horseshoe looking thing is a sign for resistance. And we put our dial here where we get the scale for resistance. And for this example, I'm going to be measuring the resistance for this spark plug wire. And this spark plug wire is supposed to have a resistance of about 10,000 ohms. Ohms being the unit of measurement for resistance. Alright, same as before, since we expect a measurement of 10,000, we're going to set our dial to the next number up, which is 20K, or in other words, 20,000 ohms. Alright, here we go. And as you can see, we got 9.89 thousand ohms of resistance, or in other words, 9,860 or 870 ohms of resistance for this spark plug wire, which is about spec. Alright, next let's go on to testing for continuity. And testing for continuity basically means checking an electric circuit to see whether current can flow through it. And when testing with a multimeter, your multimeter sends a tiny amount of voltage through that circuit, and then continuity is verified usually by an alarm or a beep. So for continuity, we set our dial here to this icon that sort of looks like a sound wave. And since we're still in the resistance setting, our test leads stay in the same area. So for example, if you wanted to make sure the wires that go to this connector are in good shape and that electricity or current can travel through them, you would attach one of your test leads to one end, and then your other test leads to the corresponding pin on the connector. And if you hear that beep, that means you got continuity. And if you do this and you don't hear a beep, it means that you got a short somewhere in this wire, or in other words, in our case, maybe a cut or burnt wire. Now I did this test on a rather small scale, but this can be done on a much larger scale, or in other words, larger circuits, or even smaller circuits than this, like a motherboard of your computer. A word of caution though, whenever you test for resistance or continuity, you have to make sure that the device is not powered, so either unplug it or remove the batteries. Next up, how to measure amps. Now when you measure amps on this multimeter, you need to switch your test lead from this slot to one of these. Now on this multimeter, this first one is fused, which means if you measure more than 200 milliamps, you're going to blow a fuse inside your multimeter, but your multimeter as a whole is going to be saved. But this second one is unfused on this multimeter, which means if you measure more than 20 amps, you're going to ruin your multimeter. Also, if you're unsure about the amount of amps you'll be measuring, but you know if it's less than 20 amps, you can always start with this higher one and then move down for a more precise reading. So for this example, we're going to measure and see how many amps this little light bulb uses. So we put our red test lead in this setting. And next we're going to set our dial, and since this light bulb is battery powered, we're going to set it to 20 amps on the DC voltage setting. And the way you measure amps is basically you place your multimeter on the power side of the circuit you're measuring. So here's the wire from the positive side of this battery. You place your red test lead closer to the power source, and then from there power travels through your multimeter, through the black test lead to the positive side of your device. And next, when we complete the circuit by connecting our ground side, our light bulb turns on and we get our reading, and as you can see we got 1.95 amps. So it was a great move putting our red test lead on this higher setting to measure 20 amps, otherwise we would have blown a fuse here. And those were the basic functions of the multimeter. Hope that cleared things up. And if you found anything useful in this video, please give it a thumbs up. Also consider checking out some of my other videos where I use this multimeter to diagnose problems with my cars. I'll put them up on the screen as video links so you can just click on it.